Colin Ferguson. For about 3 minutes on a crowded rush-hour commuter train, a man walked slowly down the aisle and fired into the passengers around him as calmly as a conductor collecting tickets. 6 people would never make it home that evening. 19 more were wounded. And when the case finally reached a courtroom, the gunman did something almost no accused mass killer in American history had ever tried. He fired his own lawyers, took over his defense, and began questioning the very people he had shot. It was the evening of December 7th, 1993. The 5:33 eastbound train pulled out of Penn Station bound for Hicksville, packed with commuters heading home to Long Island. On board was Colin Ferguson, a Jamaican-born Brooklyn resident born on January 14, 1958. He had carried with him a 9mm Ruger pistol and a bag holding roughly 160 rounds of ammunition, far more than any one person could ever need. As the train slowed near the Maryland Avenue station in Garden City Park in Nassau County, Ferguson stood, drew the pistol, and began firing into the crowd of seated passengers. A reporter who covered the case later wrote that he moved as methodically as a man punching tickets, working his way down the car without panic or hurry. It only stopped because 3 passengers, Michael O'Connor, Kevin Blum, and Mark McEntee, threw themselves on him while he paused to reload his 3rd magazine. Pinned to the floor of the car, Ferguson was already pleading, asking aloud what he had done and saying he deserved whatever was coming to him. The people he killed had simply been riding home from work. Among the dead were Amy Federici, a 27-year-old interior designer, Maria Teresa Magtoto, a 30-year-old attorney, and Dennis McCarthy, a 52-year-old office manager who was sitting beside his son Kevin when the shooting began. Kevin survived a grave wound. His father did not. Dennis's wife, Carolyn McCarthy, took her grief and turned it into a national campaign for gun control, and a few years later she was elected to Congress, where she served for nearly 2 decades. 5 victims died that night. A 6th died days later. In Ferguson's pockets, police found handwritten notes he had titled "Reasons for This," pages filled with rage toward white people, toward black people he accused of accommodating them, and toward a university that had once enrolled him, a governor, and a state board he blamed for his failures. But the trial is what made the case unforgettable. 2 well-known radical attorneys, William Kunstler and Ronald Kuby, offered to argue that a lifetime of racism had pushed Ferguson into a kind of temporary insanity, a theory they called black rage. Ferguson rejected it outright, dismissed them both, and chose to defend himself. Kuby warned anyone who would listen that the proceedings would become a complete circus, that a man this disturbed could not possibly represent himself. He was right. Ferguson stood before the court and argued that a mysterious white passenger had stolen his gun from his bag and committed the shooting while he slept. Then he cross-examined his own surviving victims on live television, one after another. One of them, Marianne Avils Manco, looked at him from the witness stand and told him flatly that she had watched him shoot everyone on that train. On February 17, 1995, the jury convicted him of 6 counts of murder and 19 counts of attempted murder. At sentencing on March 22, Judge Donald Belfi handed down 315 years and 8 months to life, setting his earliest possible parole hearing in the year 2309. Put plainly, Ferguson would have to outlive roughly 3 more centuries to ever face a parole board. What unfolded over the following weeks was unlike anything American television had shown before. Day after day, a man who had killed 6 strangers stood in a suit and politely asked the people he had wounded to recount, in detail, the worst moments of their lives, all while insisting he was the real victim of a conspiracy. Some survivors answered him directly. Others could barely look at him. Legal commentators called it a travesty, but Ferguson had a constitutional right to represent himself, and the judge let it run its course. Through all of it, he never once admitted what every witness had seen with their own eyes. Belfi called him a selfish, self-righteous coward, pointed to his complete absence of remorse, and said that Ferguson would never return to society and would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. The district attorney, Dennis Dillon, summed up the sentence by saying it was not quite infinity, but it would do. Ferguson is alive today, held at Mid-State Correctional Facility after years at the Upstate Facility in Malone. Judge Belfi died in 2023. Ferguson will die behind walls he never once tried to climb. The next man on this list refused to accept that arithmetic, and for 3 weeks in the summer of 2015, he made the entire state of New York wonder whether any wall could actually hold him. David Sweat. In the early hours of a June morning in 2015, guards at a maximum security prison in upstate New York lifted the blankets on 2 beds and found stuffed dummies arranged where 2 convicted murderers were supposed to be sleeping. The men had cut through steel, crawled through the prison's underground guts, and climbed out of a manhole on a quiet street a block away. It was the first escape in that facility's 170-year history, and one of the 2 men had already gotten away with something far worse, years before he ever picked up a hacksaw. David Sweat, born June 14, 1980, was serving life without the possibility of parole for a killing in 2002. On the 4th of July that year, Sweat, his cousin Jeffrey Nabinger, and a third man named Sean Duvall burglarized a gun store across the state line in Great Bend, Pennsylvania. Back in New York, a Broome County Sheriff's deputy named Kevin Tarsia caught them transferring the stolen firearms between vehicles in a parking lot. Sweat opened fire on the deputy and then struck him with a car, and Nabinger picked up Tarsia's own weapon and finished it at close range. Tarsia's father, Philip, later said prosecutors had told the family they could not seek the death penalty, so life without parole was the harshest sentence the law would allow. Sweat pleaded guilty and received exactly that. Duvall, who cooperated, was given 5 years. 13 years later, Sweat was housed at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, near another convicted killer named Richard Matt, who was serving 25 years to life for kidnapping, murdering, and dismembering a former employer. Over weeks of patient, nightly work, the 2 men cut through the steel at the backs of their cells, slipped into the maze of utility tunnels behind the cell block, cut their way into a steam pipe, and followed it out beneath the prison wall. When they were finally clear, Matt left behind a taunting note for the guards. They were discovered missing during the pre-dawn bed check on June 6th. A prison tailor shop worker named Joyce Mitchell had supplied the hacksaw blades and tools, some of them smuggled into the men inside frozen hamburger meat by a corrections officer named Gene Palmer. That is not a typo. Mitchell had even agreed to be the getaway driver, then lost her nerve at the last possible moment. What followed was a manhunt that stretched on for roughly 3 weeks, drew in more than 1,000 officers from dozens of agencies, and ran up overtime costs in the tens of millions of dollars. Residents across the North Country locked their doors and watched the tree lines. On June 26th, Richard Matt was shot and killed by a Border Patrol agent in the woods near Owl's Head. 2 days later, a state police sergeant named Jay Cook spotted Sweat walking alone in a field near the town of Constable, just short of the Canadian border. When Sweat broke and ran for a tree line, the sergeant fired twice, wounding him and finally ending the run. Joyce Mitchell pleaded guilty to promoting prison contraband and criminal facilitation. Palmer pleaded guilty as well and was given a 6-month jail term. For 3 weeks, the manhunt swallowed the North Country. Roadblocks went up, schools changed their schedules, and families who had never locked their doors started sleeping with the lights on. The search drew comparisons to a prison break film, and the story dominated the national news night after night. When it was finally over, a state review found that complacency and broken rules inside the prison had made the escape possible, and the fallout reached deep into the facility's staff. The tailor shop, where Joyce Mitchell had grown close to the two men, was shut down for good. Sweat himself pleaded guilty to escape, and on February 3, 2016, he was given an additional 7 to 14 years and ordered to pay nearly $80,000 in restitution for the damage to the cell block. He apologized in court to the communities that had lived in fear for weeks, to the people who felt they had to lock their homes or leave them entirely while he was loose. Sweat is alive, held after his recapture in a special unit at 5 Points Correctional Facility, confined to a cell 23 hours a day, and moved among facilities in the years since. Sweat fought concrete and steel and lost. The next man never ran from anything. He stayed at the scene. He called the police himself, and he made certain the whole world would see exactly what he had done. Brandon Clark. A 17-year-old girl from Utica, New York, had quietly built the kind of online following where thousands of strangers felt like they knew her. In the summer of 2019, the young man she had met on the internet drove her home from a concert in the city. By morning, she was gone. And what he did in the hours afterward is the reason this case still sits heavy with everyone who worked it. Bianca Devins was born on October 2, 2001. She was 17 years old, a teenager from Utica with a warm and devoted presence across her social accounts, the kind of online personality her followers felt protective of. Brandon Clark, born October 6, 1997, was from nearby Bridgeport, New York. The two had met online that spring on Instagram. Police would later describe their relationship as personally intimate, though Bianca's family disputed that characterization. On July 13, 2019, Bianca, Clark, and a friend traveled into New York City to see a Nicole Dollanganger concert. In the early hours of July 14th, after they had driven back to Utica, Clark took her life. And somehow, it gets worse. He photographed what he had done and posted the images to Discord and Instagram, attaching a callous, taunting caption for his followers to find. Users who saw the images were horrified, and several of them alerted the police. When the first officer arrived, he found Clark lying across a tarp that concealed Bianca's body. Clark then injured himself and survived, and in a call to 911 he described, with a chilling flatness, his intention to finish what he himself called the second half of a murder-suicide. The images would prove almost impossible to scrub from the internet, spreading across platforms for weeks, while her family begged strangers to stop sharing them. For the investigators and prosecutors who handled it, the hardest part was not proving what had happened. Since Clark had documented the crime himself, it was the cruelty of the aftermath, the way a teenager's death had been turned into content for an audience. Detectives who had spent entire careers working violent crime described being shaken by what they saw. The district attorney's office moved quickly, and the evidence Clark had created with his own hands left him almost nowhere to stand. Clark pleaded guilty to second-degree murder on February 10, 2020, then tried to take the plea back, claiming his lawyers had failed him. The court refused to let him. On March 16, 2021, Oneida County Judge Michael Dwyer sentenced him to 25 years to life. The sentencing hearing belonged to Bianca's family. Her mother, Kim Devins, told the court that life without her daughter would never be the same, that their family would never again be whole, and asked the parole board to show him no mercy when the day finally came. Her sister Olivia described the nightmares she could not escape, and the way strangers kept resending the images to her until she deleted every account she had. What made the case so uniquely cruel was how the images refused to die. They were reposted, mirrored, and buried inside other files, surfacing on platform after platform faster than anyone could take them down. Bianca had been part of an online world where strangers followed her closely, and now those same networks spread the final images of her against her family's desperate pleas. Vigils were held in Utica, and her family poured their grief into a fight to force technology companies to act faster, so that no other family would ever have to beg the internet to let their child rest. Her grandfather, Frank Williams, looked at Clark and told him that for the act of posting pictures of her body to satisfy his own selfish purposes, he deserved to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Clark, for his part, said he hated himself for what he had done, and that he knew sorry would never be enough. Clark is held at Attica Correctional Facility and is not eligible for parole until July 10, 2044. The case pushed lawmakers to propose a measure named for Bianca, championed by a local congressman named Anthony Brindisi, aimed at forcing social media companies to pull violent and exploitative images far faster than they had for her family. Clark wanted the entire world to see what he had done. The last man in this stretch of the list wanted the exact opposite. He kept his secrets sealed inside a single house on a quiet avenue, and he kept them there for nearly 2 years while the police circled the block and never once looked up. Kendall Francois. For almost 2 years, neighbors on a quiet avenue near a college campus complained about a smell they could never quite place. Inside one house, a former middle school hall monitor lived with his parents and his sister, and with the remains of 8 women he had killed. Police had already questioned him. They had watched him, followed him, even locked him up briefly. And still, the bodies stayed hidden in the attic and the crawl space below. Kendall Francois, born July 26, 1971, murdered at least 8 women in Poughkeepsie, New York, between the fall of 1996 and the summer of 1998. He concealed their bodies in the attic and a basement crawl space of his family's home at 99 Fulton Avenue, which he shared with his parents and his sister, a short walk from Vassar College. He was a former Army soldier, discharged for his weight not long after finishing basic training at Fort Sill, and he had worked as a student monitor at Arlington Middle School, where the children had nicknamed him Stinky for his body odor. His victims were sex workers he solicited downtown, and most were strangled, often during or after a dispute over payment. The women had names and lives that mattered. Wendy Myers, Gina Barone, Catherine Marsh, who was pregnant at the time, Kathleen Hurley, Mary Healy Giacone, Sandra French, Audrey Pugliese, and Katina Newmaster. They ranged in age from their 20s into their 50s. What makes the case so hard to sit with is how close the investigation came, again and again, and how it kept missing. Detectives interviewed Francois in January of 1998. They sent an informant wearing a wire to talk to him. They even jailed him briefly on a misdemeanor assault charge that carried a 15-day sentence. Police had him in a cell, and they let him walk right back out. And no, I'm not making that up. The stench from the house had simply folded into its general squalor, and no one made the connection. It ended on September 1st, 1998, when a woman named Christine Sala escaped Francois as he tried to strangle her and went straight to the police. Within hours of his arrest, he confessed. He told investigators he wanted to speak with the chief prosecutor about the missing women, and then he led them, room by room, to the remains. The recovery was so severe that officers had to wear hazardous materials suits to bring the victims out of the house. The district attorney, William Grady, told reporters that Francois had something to say about every single one of the missing women. In June of 2000, Francois pleaded guilty to all 8 murders to take the death penalty off the table. On August 8th, Dutchess County Judge Thomas Dolan sentenced him to 8 consecutive life terms without parole, saying that a capital trial would serve no good purpose. Francois showed nothing. By several accounts, he giggled as the families of his victims read their statements aloud. Years later, he told a criminologist named Casey Jordan that his real mistake had been confessing at all, that if he had only kept quiet, no one could ever have pinned the murders on him. He told a reporter that he could have kept going, that it would have gone on, and that they never would have found a thing. He had been held at Attica before his transfer to Attica Correctional Facility, where he died on September 11, 2014, at 43, of natural causes after years of illness. He denied any role in the disappearance of a 9th woman, Michelle Eason, and was never charged in her case. The most haunting part of the case was how ordinary the house looked from the street. Inside, the family lived in deepening filth while the evidence of 8 murders sat in the attic and the crawl space around them. The women Francois targeted were among the most vulnerable people in the city, and for nearly 2 years, their disappearances drew far less urgency than they deserved. By the time investigators finally understood what they were dealing with, the man they wanted had been within arm's reach the entire time, hiding the truth just a few feet over their heads. Francois carried most of his secrets to a prison hospital bed, and the rest came out into the light. But he was far from the most dangerous man New York has ever locked away. Some of the others did not just kill. They turned hatred itself into a weapon, and a few of them kept right on aiming it from behind the walls that were supposed to stop them. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Joseph Christopher. Over a single weekend in the fall of 1980, 4 black males were killed in and around Buffalo, New York, gunned down on the street by a stranger who seemed to melt away each time. The newspapers named him for the weapon he carried. What almost no one understood was that the man behind the killings was a soldier who had walked into a hospital only weeks earlier, asked to be committed, and been turned away. Joseph Christopher was born on July 26, 1955, a Buffalo native and an Army private who had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. In September of 1980, he tried and failed to have himself admitted to the Buffalo Psychiatric Center. About 2 weeks later, the killings began. Over 3 days in late September, Christopher killed 4 black males in and around Buffalo and Niagara Falls with a sawed-off .22 caliber rifle. The youngest was 14-year-old Glenn Dunn, killed outside a supermarket. The others were Harold Green, 32, Emmanuel Thomas, 30, and Joseph McCoy. The press began calling him the .22 caliber killer, and a city that already lived with deep racial tension began to feel like it was under siege. A couple of weeks after that, 2 black cab drivers, Parler Edwards, 71, and Ernest Jones, 40, were found mutilated, their bodies desecrated in a way that unsettled even the most seasoned detectives in the region. And somehow, it gets worse. That December, on a Christmas furlough from Fort Benning in Georgia, Christopher carried his spree to Manhattan, stabbing black and Hispanic men in the street and earning a second nickname, the Midtown Slasher, before returning to Buffalo for still more attacks. Back at Fort Benning in January, he slashed a black soldier with a knife and then tried to take his own life. In a psychiatric session afterward, he reportedly admitted that he felt he simply had to kill black people. The case finally cracked open when a search of his home and a family farm in Chautauqua County turned-up shell casings, and a gun barrel that tied him directly to the Buffalo murders. The FBI profiler John Douglas had already traveled to the city to help, and the district attorney who led the prosecution, Edward Cosgrove, would later remember it simply as a terrible time for the community. Christopher was indicted in April of 1981. He waived his right to a jury, represented himself, and was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder for Glenn Dunn, Harold Green, and Emmanuel Thomas, then sentenced in 1982 to 60 years to life. For months, Buffalo lived in genuine fear. Black residents changed their routines, avoided certain streets after dark, and watched strangers more closely than they ever had before. The killings landed in a city already strained by racial tension and their randomness. A teenager outside a store, a man waiting for a ride, made the threat feel like it was everywhere at once. That a soldier in uniform could move through the country committing these attacks and then return to base as if nothing had happened made the eventual arrest feel less like relief and more like disbelief. That was not the end of it. In 1985, his conviction was overturned because the trial judge had wrongly blocked testimony about his mental competence. At a Buffalo retrial, his own attorneys, among them Thomas Aoano, conceded that he had done the killings but argued that he was insane, and the jury split the difference with a compromise manslaughter verdict. Separately, a Manhattan jury rejected an insanity defense and convicted him of murdering a 19-year-old messenger named Luis Rodriguez and wounding another man named Ivan Frazier. While he was held at Attica, Christopher claimed in a 1983 interview that he had actually committed at least 13 killings, a number some accounts later put even higher. He died of cancer on March 1, 1993, at 37, having spent most of his time inside in protective custody because of the racial nature of his crimes. Christopher's hatred had a target and a type. The next man had no cause at all, only a compulsion he would one day describe as an addiction and a body count that would make him the most prolific killer in the history of New York State. Joel Rifkin. For 4 years, women vanished from the streets of New York City, and almost no one connected the cases. The man responsible drove the same quiet routes, returned each night to the Long Island house where he had grown up, and kept trophies of what he had done. In the end, he was not undone by a detective or a tip. He was stopped by 2 state troopers who noticed that his pickup truck had no rear license plate. Joel Rifkin was born on January 20, 1959, adopted as an infant and raised in East Meadow on Long Island. Between 1989 and 1993, he murdered at least 17 women, most of them sex workers, which made him the most prolific serial killer in New York State history. His first known victim, in February of 1989, was a woman he knew only as Susie, later identified as Heidi Balch. Parts of her were found scattered as far away as a New Jersey golf course, and she would not be positively identified for more than 2 decades, until DNA finally gave her back her name in 2013. Rifkin typically strangled his victims and dispersed their remains across New York and New Jersey. Among the women later identified were Barbara Jacobs, Mary Ellen DeLuca, Yun Lee, Anna Lopez, Mary Catherine Williams, Iris Sanchez, Jenny Soto, Leah Evans, Lorraine Orvieto, and Mary Ann Holloman. It all came apart on June 28, 1993. Troopers on the Southern State Parkway noticed that Rifkin's Mazda pickup was missing its rear plate and moved to pull him over. He ran instead, leading a chase of more than 20 minutes before crashing into a light pole. When the troopers reached the truck, they caught the smell, and in the bed, wrapped in a tarp, was the body of his final victim, 22-year-old Tiffany Bresciani. He had killed 17 women, and he was caught because of a missing license plate. That is not a typo. Under questioning, Rifkin confessed to all 17, wrote out the names he could remember, and sketched maps to where he had left the bodies, remaining calm and clinical the entire time, as if he were reciting errands. What unnerved investigators most was not the number of victims, but how calmly Rifkin had lived alongside what he had done. He kept items belonging to the women in the very house where he had grown up, moving through an ordinary suburban life in between the killings. He had operated for 4 years across 2 states without ever landing on a suspect list, and he might have continued indefinitely if not for a missing piece of metal on the back of his truck. In the end, the most prolific killer in the state's history was undone by a routine traffic stop. On May 9, 1994, a Nassau County jury convicted him of second-degree murder for the killing of Tiffany Bresciani, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life plus additional time for reckless endangerment. Through later trials and guilty pleas, he was convicted of 9 murders in all, stacking up to an aggregate of 203 years to life, which pushes any possible parole to the year 2197, when he would be well over 200 years old. At sentencing, he told the families that he was sorry for what he had done to them and their daughters, and that what he had done could never be forgiven. In 1996, citing his notoriety and his violent clashes with other inmates, including an assault on Rikers Island that left him with a black eye, officials placed Rifkin in involuntary protective custody at Attica, confined 23 hours a day. He sued over the isolation and lost, with a state appeals court upholding it as constitutional in 2000. He was later moved to Clinton Correctional Facility, where he remains, kept apart from the general population among more than 200 segregated inmates. In a 2011 interview, he described his urge to kill as an addiction that had been very hard to stop. Rifkin is alive. Rifkin killed for reasons even he could never fully explain. The man who comes next killed for a cause. And from inside his cell at Attica, he helped set in motion a plot aimed at the heart of New York City itself. El Sayed Nosair. On a November night in 1990, a controversial rabbi finished a speech at a Midtown Manhattan hotel and was shot dead in front of a room full of witnesses. The gunman tried to run, wounded a postal officer in a shootout, and was caught within minutes. And yet, somehow, a jury would soon refuse to convict him of the murder that an entire room had just watched happen. El Sayed Nosair was born on November 16, 1955 in Egypt, and became a naturalized United States citizen in 1989. On November 5, 1990, shortly after 9 in the evening, he assassinated Rabbi Meir Kahane, the founder of the Jewish Defense League, just after Kahane finished speaking at a hotel on Lexington Avenue. Nosair shot him as he answered questions from the audience, then tried to flee and commandeer a taxi, and was wounded and captured after a gunfight with a postal inspection officer named Carlos Acosta. Kahane was pronounced dead at the hospital. At the time, investigators treated it as the act of a lone gunman. They had no idea what they were actually looking at. At his state trial in December of 1991, Nosair was defended by William Kunstler, the same attorney who had once offered to represent Colin Ferguson. The jury delivered a verdict that legal scholars would call bizarre. They acquitted Nosair of murdering Kahane, but convicted him of wounding Acosta and of illegally possessing the gun. Some jurors pointed to reasonable doubt because no witness had directly seen him fire the fatal shots. In plain terms, the jury accepted that he had shot the officer while fleeing the scene, but not that he had killed the man he was fleeing from. The presiding justice, Alvin Schlesinger, condemned the acquittal as against the overwhelming weight of the evidence and devoid of common sense, and told Nosair that he had committed a kind of assault on the country on its constitution, and on people simply trying to exist together in peace. In January of 1992, he imposed the maximum the law allowed, 7 1/3 to 22 years, and Nosair was sent to Attica. But Attica did not stop him. Using the prison phone and visitation systems, Nosair stayed connected to the cell led by Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, the man known as the Blind Sheikh, feeding into a wider conspiracy to bomb New York landmarks in what investigators came to call a planned day of terror, a plot that would become entwined with the February 26, 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. In a 1995 federal trial, he was convicted of 9 counts, including seditious conspiracy and murder in aid of racketeering, with this jury finding that his killing of Kahani had been part of that larger conspiracy all along. He was sentenced to life plus 15 years. Osama bin Laden had reportedly helped fund his earlier defense. In hindsight, the case is remembered as a warning that almost no one read in time. When investigators searched Nosair's home after the shooting, they seized boxes of material pointing to a far larger network, much of it left untranslated for years, while the killing was treated as the act of a single disturbed man. By the time the full picture came together, the World Trade Center had already been bombed once, and the connections ran straight back to the cell that Nosair had stayed loyal to from behind the walls of Attica. Federal judges later rejected his attempts at a new trial, with Judge Richard Holwell pointing in 2008 to mountains of evidence against him, and Judge Loretta Preska turning him down again in 2012. Nosair is alive in federal custody, reported to be held at a federal medical center in Springfield, Missouri, a high-security medical facility that once also held the Blind Sheikh himself. In one of the strangest turns of the entire story, Nosair's own son, born Abdulaziz Nosair, renounced his father's ideology and became a peace activist and author under the name Zach Ibrahim. Nosair believed he was serving a cause far larger than himself. The last man on this list believed something stranger still, that he had been sent by angels to rid the world of monsters, and that the people he killed were the only ones who could not see what he truly was. Glenn Race. In the spring of 2007, a man from Nova Scotia became convinced that he was a godlike being, sent by angels to hunt vampires and demons walking among the living. He killed 2 men in Canada, then crossed into New York State and killed a third, a caretaker working alone at a remote hunting camp. By the time he was finally caught at the Mexican border, he was still certain he had done nothing wrong. Glenn Race was born around 1981 in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and had been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic who believed he was an immortal entity charged with cleansing the world of vampires and demons. And no, I'm not making that up. In May of 2007, that delusion left 3 men dead across 2 countries. After fatally stabbing Michael Knott, 44, and Trevor Brewster, 45, in the Halifax area, Race fled into New York State. On May 10th, at a secluded hunting lodge near Moores in Clinton County, he shot the caretaker, 35-year-old Darcy Manor, once in the back with a stolen .44 caliber Ruger rifle while Manor worked on a water pump, unaware anyone else was there. He then stole Manor's pickup truck, credit card, and rifle, and used an all-terrain vehicle to drag the body into the woods. Race ran south, swapping stolen license plates to disguise the truck, and was arrested on May 15th near Los Indios, Texas, as he tried to cross into Mexico. He fought the Border Patrol agent who stopped him, biting him and reaching for the agent's sidearm, and he was carrying the murder weapon, ammunition, knives, camouflage makeup, and his victim's stolen cards when he was finally taken in. He was tried in Clinton County in a bench trial, decided by a judge rather than a jury, with District Attorney Andrew Wiley prosecuting. On January 15, 2009, Race was convicted of first-degree murder, first-degree burglary, and several counts of grand larceny, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Before sentencing, he declared that he was innocent and could do no wrong. The strangest legacy of the case is the contradiction sitting at the very center of it. In one country, a court looked at this man and this illness and concluded he could not be held criminally responsible for what he had done. In another, a court set that same illness aside and sentenced him to die in prison. Glenn Race exists today in the gap between those two judgments. A man two nations agreed was profoundly sick and could not agree on what to do with. His delusion never wavered. He had crossed an international border convinced he was a divine hunter of monsters, killed a stranger who was simply fixing a water pump, and dragged the body into the trees. And even at sentencing, he spoke as though he were the only sane person in the room. For the families of Michael Knott, Trevor Brewster, and Darcy Manor, there was no satisfying resolution to reach for, only the cold fact that the man responsible would never again be free in either country. Darcy Manor's mother, Jane Manor, told him that she had watched him through 20 months of proceedings and never once seen a flicker of remorse or grief, that he was a disgrace to mankind, and that her hope was simply that he would never again be free to harm another human being, including his own family and friends. In November of 2010, a state appeals court upheld his conviction and rejected his claim that his lawyers had failed him. He was then extradited to Canada, where in 2014, a Nova Scotia judge found him not criminally responsible for the 2 Halifax killings by reason of his mental illness, the same illness an American court had effectively set aside. He was returned to New York to serve out his life sentence. His Canadian lawyer, Joel Pink, said he was absolutely shocked to learn the American defense had abandoned an insanity plea and pursued a renewed appeal on those grounds around 2016, calling it warranted, even as he admitted he could not be sure it would succeed. No record of a successful appeal or a new trial has surfaced since. Race's last verified facility is Attica, though his precise current status is not confirmed in public records. 8 men, every one of them either still locked inside New York's prison system or dead within its walls, and not one of them ever walking free again. Their names fade with time, but the people they harmed are still remembered by the families who carry it every single day. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.